Hi, I'm Pamela Bailey, and I'm the creator of the Antebellum Diaspora Project, a descendant reunification project where we're telling the stories of our ancestors who were separated by slavery in the antebellum South. Today's guest is George E. Frierson, a man who wears many hats in his community. He's an oral historian and educator, a community leader and activist, and the curator of the Mary McLeod Bethune Learning Center and Art Gallery. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. Frierson. So I actually want you to start by telling me a little bit about growing up in Clarendon County, just a little bit about your parents and your grandparents.
Okay, my grandfather and my grandmother were born back in the 1800s. My grandfather, 1899 on December the 7th, and this would be my mother's father. And her mother was born in January of 1896. She had, there was 9 of them. She was the 7th child out of 9. And that really is the grandparents I knew, because I didn't know my father's side of the family until I got old. Mm-hmm. And but I traced them back to the early 1800s. Well, I take it back. I traced them back into 1700s. I knew my mother's father is the only one of my grandparents that was still alive when I was born. He passed in February of 1986.
Oh, wow. So he was blessed to live a nice, long life.
86 years old.
That's awesome. Now, what part of Clarendon County did they live in?
They lived in Mount Zion, Alcaloo area. I was actually born in Alcaloo.
The reason that I wanted to talk with you, of course, is that you are a historian. You do a lot of oral history, but you also do a lot of research. So I just wanted to find out about the beginnings. Like, did you hear many of the stories about your own ancestors from the elders, or did you learn about your family much later?
I learned about other than my maternal grandfather, I learned about them much later.
Now, did your grandfather, especially being born in the 1800s, did he talk much about his life? Was he or other people in the community at that time, did they talk to you about what life used to be like back then?
No, well, he actually was in Philadelphia. In fact, he lived in Philadelphia all of my life, and he passed in Philadelphia in 1986. So he was not around, but he would come down maybe twice a year. And well, I knew that was my mother's father, so he was special to me because he was the only one I had to say grandfather. I never had to say grandmother, but he was the only one I had to say grandfather to, because he was my only grandfather that I knew, and my other grandfather passed in 1945 before I was born.
Now, were you raised on family land, or did you know where your family had lived before you were born?
You know, I was actually raised in a sharecropping situation in Alcaloo. My mother had left the area called Bloomville and came to Alcaloo, and I was raised on a sharecropping farm there. In fact, didn't have electricity until I was around about the 6th or 7th grade.
Wow.
I had to study on the lamp lights.
Okay. And so I'm really interested. Do you share any of this history with your children or grandchildren?
All of my children don't have a choice but know our history that I know.
I hear you. It's just too important to not tell them, right? Would you agree with that statement?
It is. And in fact, I tell people in the state of South Carolina, there is a law, South Carolina Code 59-29-55. And it says that the history of the Black people must be taught. That is the current law. We hear this thing about critical race theories and whatever. That's just a dog whistle to discourage people from seeking something that they would need to know.
Right. Absolutely. So, let's go to the history a little bit. And I do know that you went, if I understand correctly, from that sharecropping farm and on through school, and you eventually became a military man. Is that correct?
That is correct. I went to high school, graduated from high school, went to UF college. Then I was doing the draft time. The draft ended after I'd been in the service over a year. And so, I said, well, let's just go and get this on out of the way and move, because at that time I was not aware that any of my ancestors had served. But more recently, I found out that my grandfather served in World War One. But again, people were going out of the community. I see guys leaving, and so I knew what the deal was. We had to sign up with the selective service. And so when I did, I got that notice, and I finished out my year, first year of college, and then I said, well, let me go ahead and get this over. Well, during that time, it was Vietnam was going on, and I like to make sure that people understand that Vietnam was never declared a war. It was a police action.
Mm. Okay, and can you talk a little bit about the difference in it being a war and a police action?
A war has to be declared by Congress. Congress never declared Vietnam as a war. But we lost 58,220 of my fellow Americans in a police act. And right now, we still seem to be having problems with the police.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about a little bit of the history that you talk about in Clarendon County. First of all, Clarendon County is very significant. We don't hear enough about it in this country. In my own opinion, I don't think it's written about because a lot of people don't realize that the very beginnings of what later became the Brown versus the Board of Education decision was started in Clarendon County. In the landmark court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the separate but equal doctrine that governs schools and public facilities did not violate the U.S. Constitution. But in reality and in every conceivable way, accommodations for Black citizens were always subpar to those of white citizens. Briggs versus Elliott was one of the other 4 cases that were combined with Brown versus the Board of Education to overturn separate but equal policies in public schools. A young lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, actually spent significant time working with a Clarendon County lawyer to actually bring these cases, particularly the Briggs versus Elliott case, to the forefront. So I want to know a little bit about how that case affected you and what, if anything, did you know about that case growing up? I know that you know a lot about it now, but growing up as a kid.
Growing up, I knew nothing about it. All I was doing was going to a school when I wasn't out working, picking cotton or whatever. And, well, as you say, growing up, I had no idea of the case.
Now, let me ask about the conditions, though, because that could be very different. Were you aware as a young Black man, school-age child, did you know that the school that you were attending was very different from the school that the white children were attending?
Well, that was very noticeable. But again, at that time, because the culture of the South and white supremacy, if I may say so, it never dawned on me that things were different outside of my sphere of recognition. I just wanted to grow up and more than likely get away like my other siblings, leave the South and make a better life for myself elsewhere. So is it safe to say that growing up as a child, segregation and supremacy and race, I mean, that's pretty much what you knew. That's all that you saw and all that you knew within the community? That's all the first 11 years of my secondary school life, I went to an all-Black school. The Brown case went to the Supreme Court on Tuesday, December the 9th, 1952, the very day I was born. Brown 2 actually went in 55 with all deliberate speed. But in some cases, it was implemented in 65 when I would have been in the 6th grade. And then in the year 70, the Supreme Court said, you got to do it. And so that was my senior year in high school. So I went to just my senior year in the integrated school. Okay. That's my 12th grade year. That was the only year I ever went to an integrated school, my senior year. Okay. Now, one of the things that happened around 65, when it became obvious that even if it didn't happen in that moment, it was going to be happening soon in the community that I grew up in, Mullen, South Carolina, and a lot of the surrounding community,
these schools started to pop up as academies. And these were schools that were paid for very often and sponsored by churches, that were sort of an answer to white families against desegregation. So they started, some of them, pulling their children out of these schools and were sending them to local academies that were, again, private schools and white-only schools. Did that happen in Clarendon County too?
That happened in Clarendon County. In fact, on June 24th, 1965, Mr. Joseph Emerson Wheeler sued Old Clarendon School District 8 so that his granddaughter, Shirley Ann Wheeler, could attend East Clarendon Middle School as a fourth grader, I think. Or she was behind me in school. And she's the first Black to go to East Clarendon Middle School, period.
No, do you remember having, as a kid, like any major interaction with other white children?
No, we lived on a place where the guy was not rich, but he had access to money.
Mm-hmm.
And his wife and his daughter had to work along my parents and us for him to make a living.
Mm-hmm.
But, I never gave it any thought. That was just the way it was. And so we just accepted things the way they were and we moved on.
So in your community, though, especially living in such close proximity to the family that you worked for, your family worked for, were the children able to play together at all?
Well, my younger siblings, the family that we grew up in, had 3 daughters. So us boys would not play with a white girl. But my younger sister, I actually interacted with the other white girls because they were more in her age category.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the way it was, and we accepted that way, and we moved on. As far as speaking and salutations, we were always taught to be respectful to elder people, regardless of what their race was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You would hear older Black men call white guys, yes, sir, and no, sir. So that was the way it was. I guess we were indoctrinated, if I may say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So even with young children, I understand that sometimes the deference was made by Black adults to very young people. So was that your experience?
Yes. In fact, as I got a little older, and my father had his own place, but was using some equipment of a white planer, and I would call the owner of the equipment, yes, sir, and no, sir, and a younger child of that planer would call my father by his first name. And as I got older, that just didn't work.
Okay. So that did make you feel some kind of way, that you were expected to give respect, but you saw that it wasn't coming back from any other direction.
Here we go.
That had to be tough. That had to be really difficult.
It was, but again, there were culture that was already in place.
Mm-hmm.
A foundation had been laid by our forefathers, and we try to respect that foundation. And when we got old, we were expected to be able to make it on our own. So my thing was to get an education, probably go to the city, as we call it, and make a living for myself. But the military had other plans for me.
Now, I do want to ask you, I'm going to go back a little bit to your military service. And I think I may have asked you this question when I was down in South Carolina talking with you when we were filming for my documentary project. But I wanted to ask about, as a person in the military serving the US, what we do know is that one of the most dangerous situations that you could be in the American South was to be a soldier and to walk around in uniform, that there were so many lynchings of soldiers because they had on their uniforms and because particularly white men took it as Black men being uppity or trying to enforce their right to be treated, I can say fully human or as full citizens. Were you aware of that when you were in the military?
Well, I was aware of it when I came back from overseas because when I was leaving North Carolina, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, outside of Fayetteville, was my last duty station. And everyone knew that I was from South Carolina, so I could drive from Fayetteville to Clarendon County. And my platoon sergeant would tell me, Sergeant Frierson, I don't want you driving down the road in uniform because if something happened, I don't want you to stop side the road in your uniform. And then later on, I found out, that on February 12, 1946, Sergeant Isaac Woodard was blinded down in Bethune, South Carolina. I found out that you had the Houston riot that happened on August the 23rd, 1917, when the 24th Infantry had 19 Black men that were hung. And so these kind of things, I was not aware of that at that time. But while I was in the military, I could see the white preferences. Most of my platoon sergeants were white. And have to look back on things now because the Secretary of Defense is a Black man, and his name is Lloyd Austin.
Having an African American serve as the current U.S. Secretary of Defense is proof that the U.S. military has made substantial progress. But from the time that Black citizens began serving in World War I, they were targeted by white supremacists and they were victims of racial violence, which typically escalated at the very sight of a Black soldier in uniform. When it comes to myself, like I haven't always had an interest in history. And I can say that honestly because I never saw myself in it. I didn't know that we were so deeply involved in the creation of this country until I became an adult and started learning and studying on my own, even though I had a father who would tell me a lot of information because he wanted to make sure that I had a lot of pride, in my own community, in my own people. And, he began to share with me just how none of this could have happened without our families, just in terms of the development of the country and the literal building of the country. But when did you start having such a deep interest and dedication to history?
When I was reading newspaper one day, and I was reminded of the George Stinney Jr. story, which was talked about all my life because that happened in Alcaloo, and I was born in Alcaloo.
I want you to go into detail about that story because, and again, this happened well before you were born. And so again, I didn't know anything about this story until I was almost, I'm sure, an adult. So not only have you preserved history, which is one of the things that I admire about you, but probably the thing that I most admire about you is that not only do you just learn it for the sake of sharing it, but you have applied what you know to sort of right some injustices. And one of the things I want to talk to you about a little bit is about the wrongful killing of George Stinney Jr., about the state of South Carolina. So can you just give us a little bit of information about that case?
George Stinney was born on October the 21st, 1929, Railroad Avenue, Pinewood, Sumter County, South Carolina. And because of job opportunities, Mr. George Stinney Sr., had an opportunity to come to Alcaloo, work for one of the more well-known industries in the country. So he brought his children to Alcaloo. At that time, Mr. George Stinney Jr. would have been an elementary school child, and he had 3 younger siblings, and so they all went to Alcaloo Elementary School. Now, he had an assigned duty. He had to milk the cow, feed the cow, and watch his younger sister, who was 7 years old at the time. And on Friday, March the 24th, 1944, they were approached by two young white girls asking for directions to find Maypop. So Mr. Stinney told them that he didn't know where they were, didn't see them. So they went on. When the girls did not return home that night, there was an alarm out that they were missing, and the owner of the business had his employees to go out and search for the girls. And of course, when it got dark, they had to cancel the search to the next morning. And on the very next day, as they proceeded to go out and search, George Stinney Jr. let it be known that he had seen the girls the previous day. So suspicion immediately fell on him. And round about midday that day, according to his baby sister, God bless her, she's no longer with us. She said a whole bunch of white men in cars came and picked up her brother Johnny and George. Johnny, of course, was older than George. And they took him down the road and they threw Johnny out and tell him, don't let the sun go down on you. Well, I'm going to just say it, Nick. And so he got so fearful for his life that he went to New York and he never returned back to South Carolina. He's now deceased.
Now, the thing that struck me when I read about the George Stinney case is that this child was very small. Like, if I'm reading correctly, he was like maybe
5'1", 95 pounds.
Right. So he was a very small child. These folks who accused this child of this crime were saying that in the broad daylight, he was able to pick these girls up, two children, and move their bodies. First kill them with something, and then move their bodies without anybody in that community seeing him. Now, just seeing him, as you described in your childhood, it would not have been common to see a Black boy playing with white girls in the first place. And to assume that neither a Black or white adult would see him and think that there was something odd about that, it's just crazy. But we understand, especially during that time where there was just going to be a quickness to blame somebody in the Black community. And we're going to get somebody. So even if the details didn't add up, even if, it sounded physically impossible, even if there was a witness, his sister said he didn't do this, like we were together, that a child who was too small to do what he was accused of doing could still be charged. So was that a part of what intrigued you about this?
It did. Number one, he was about the size of an 8 or 9-year-old, not a 14-year-old. And one of the victims was actually bigger than him. The girl probably would have weighed 100, maybe 115, 120 pounds. And then there were two girls.
Right. So I have an adult daughter. She's in her 20s, and she's about 125 pounds. And when I think about the foolishness of thinking that a 9-year-old could pick her up and move her body without anybody seeing it, or even at 120 something pounds, that she could still pick up two kids and dispose of bodies. It's just crazy. Now, another thing it didn't escape me that you talked about George Stinney's family moving to Alkaloo from Pinewood. And I do know that Pinewood has at least one of the largest plantations, not just in South Carolina, but one of the largest slaveholders, former Governor John Lawrence Manning, that plantation there. And so I think it's really interesting that from the 1700s, when the Manning family, were slaveholders, his father was also a slaveholder, Richard Irving Manning, all the way to the 1940s, how even though slavery had, and I may put this in air quotes, technically ended with emancipation in 1865, how the mentality of the right to Black bodies, to do what you wanted to do with a Black body, how that still existed, how that was still in the air, very much so in the slavery state. So even though reasonable people knew that George Stinney had not done this. And I've seen some folk talk about this. I've seen a woman talk about her father being there at the courthouse and how she said, and I think I read the article, it was about you and the work that you've done. She said that her father had said to them, that's not right. Like they all knew that this boy hadn't done it. As a matter of fact, if I understand correctly, he was so small, in fact, that they literally had to sit him on a stack of Bibles so that he could be raised up high enough to be able to sit in the chair that was going to kill him. And his arms, the restraints, his hand, little arms kept falling out of the restraints because he was such a tiny kid. Is that correct?
Well, that is correct. Now, I don't know if it was Bibles, but he had to be elevated in the electric chair because the electric chair is designed for adults.
Designed for adults.
And he was just all on everywhere around. And when they got to restrain him on, as you said, straps, they had to tie him in the chair. And the mask that they put over his face, it was too big. And so when they administered the first charge of 2,400 volts onto his body, the force of the voltage blew the mask off his face, and he was exposed from those 50 witnesses that actually came from Clarendon County to witness his execution. And after that, they didn't want to talk about what they had seen, because I tell people, now, if you have never seen anyone die, don't wish that on somebody, because that's not a very good feeling.
Right, right. That's very interesting. I heard, and the quote's not gonna be an exact quote, but I remember reading that years after George Stinney died, when Emmett Till was killed, one of the things that Martin Luther King said about that case was, it's easy to blame the men who pulled him out of his great uncle Moses' home, but it's actually the entire community that had allowed these things to happen, particularly the white community who knew that these things were wrong, and those that kept silent when they knew that these things were wrong. Do you think that that's an accurate or fair description?
It's one of Dr. King's quotes is, I don't worry about the loudness of my enemies. I'm saddened by the silence of my friends. So that's one of his quotes. And again, people with good intentions or good hearts, they won't stand by and look at injustice, because, again, I quote scripture from time to time because I teach it in the book of Isaiah, the 5th chapter, and the 20th verse. It says, woe to them that call evil good and good evil, that take darkness for light and light for darkness, that take bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. We notice that these are all people. And if you can go and try to convince yourself that one is the other, then something is wrong with you.
Okay. Now, how did people feel like? Because this has always been sort of a stain on the community, that this thing happened, and people around the world know about the Stinney case. So when you made the decision, the bold decision, that you wanted to bring this to light, that you wanted to have this young man's name cleared, did you get any pushback within the community?
I pushed back from my family.
And what was their concern?
Fear. And I guess I was absent from school when they were teaching fear.
Well, I will say this, is that their fears in the past have been very, like, it's not been something that wasn't justified, because just like with George Stinney's family, there were real world consequences. There were real consequences for just exercising your human rights. We're not even talking about voting and just other legal things, just your human rights. So what made you different? What made you decide that in spite of the fact that there are going to be some people whose families were involved in this thing, that they're on the wrong side of this history, they're going to be upset that I am even bringing this up again? What made you push ahead anyway?
When I heard a family member went and said, you need to leave this alone. But this same family member was a deacon in the church.
Mm.
And 2 Timothy 1:7 said, for God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And you wearing that title of manner as deacon, but yet you're scared.
Right. So there are people, though, there are some people who know the word, and then others who know how to take it further and apply the word. And it sounds like you were able to use your faith in order to actually exercise the application of the word and just to move forward anyway. Now, I want to ask now, even then, even in 2010, I'm sorry, 2014, when at the conclusion of the matter was that the courts said that this could not have happened, and we're going to clear this young man's name. He's gone. His family has still been affected by it. The community has still been affected by it, but at least we can clear his name. There was, as if I read correctly, at least one woman there in Clarendon County who claims that she knew something about the case, that he had threatened her, and that he was rightfully executed. How do you then, when you hear something like that, even in these modern days, these times that we exist in now, how do you come against something like that?
Well, I'm going to say this, and I always give credit and honor to her, my first lady. And when I say my first lady, I'm talking about my mother.
Mm-hmm.
She would always tell me, boy, be able to make up your own mind and think for yourself.
So now I've only got a few more questions for you. And again, I just want to thank you for your time. Like, this is so meaningful to me personally. I know it's going to be meaningful to the listeners. Again, I just think you're an amazing person. I have so much respect for you. And so just my last question for you, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want people to remember about you?
He loved God and his fellow man.
That is a fantastic way to end this interview. Like I said, you are a treasure. You're not just a treasure to South Carolina, but I do believe that you are a national treasure. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe to the Antebellum Diaspora Project podcast.